Welcome back to the channel and to part 2 of my review of One Palestine Complete, The Jews and Arabs Under the British Mandate by Tom Segev. If you haven't seen my part 1, which is talking about the Jews and the Zionists, you could go back and see that one first. You don't have to. The next part will be on the British and the UN. You can see them in whatever order you like. Hopefully it will be useful. And as I said in my first part, and I'll say in my third part, can't talk about all of the ideas of this book. The scope is from the times that the Turks were ruling all the way up until the time that the British left. So rather than take on a chronological view, I've decided to simply talk about the different major parties involved here. So one of the things that I mentioned in the last review in part 1 is that David Ben-Gurion has become very clear to me in all my reading, but particularly in this book, as a generational leader and as the man most responsible for creating the state of Israel as it is today. Without David Ben-Gurion, I don't know that things necessarily go the way they did. Even though there were a lot of other pieces in place for the Israelis, David Ben-Gurion is a major part of what happens. And there was no Palestinian equivalent. And we'll talk about this more in future reviews, but you have to realize the British didn't want a unified Palestinian leader. And so they had rival families, the Al-Husseinis and the Al-Nashashibis, competing against each other. One was the mayor of Jerusalem and one was the Grand Mufti, which was this created post that really didn't exist under the Ottomans, but they tried to give it some kind of leadership. But there was not only was there no recognized leader of the Palestinians, but even the one who could possibly be considered a recognized leader was torn by factionalism. He also had people like King Abdullah of Jordan working against him because Abdullah wanted to take all of the West Bank for himself to enrich Jordan and the Hashemite kingdom. So we all know this now, but it wasn't known to all the parties at that time. But what we do know is there was no equivalent to Ben-Gurion on the Palestinian side. And here, the Arabs in Palestine had no organized national movement comparable to the Zionists, nor did they have a recognized leader. And that cannot be underestimated when you're talking about forming a nation, that if you're going to do so, you're going to have leadership, dynamic leadership that runs at every level, at the local level, down at let's say, the level of the synagogues, the mosques, whatever might have been. And what was the Palestinian view on Zionism? We do not at all oppose the Jews. We only oppose Zionism. That is not the same thing. Zionism has no roots at all in Moses' law. It is an invention of Herzl's. So everyone knew this. Everyone knew that Zionism was not a religious movement. It was a secular movement that used Judaism to its advantage. But the Palestinians knew early on the score with the Zionists. They were not fooled. The Zionists managed to fool all of Europe and most of the West, but they did not fool the Palestinians. If you want to kill a nation, conquer its land and tear out its tongue. That is exactly what the Zionists want to do to the Arab nation. This is al-Sakakini, which is a character who threads throughout the entire book, a really interesting man, an Arab Christian, but one very fiercely loyal to the idea of Palestine and very anti-Zionist, as one naturally would be. The Arabs believe that the Jews wish to expel them from the country. I gave this quote in part 1, but I'm saying it again here because I think it's useful to understand that this was known. From the beginning, the Palestinians knew what the Zionists wanted to do, and they didn't want to allow them to do it. And they even gave a really interesting counterexample. Like the Jews, who based their demand for a national home in Palestine on historical justice, the Arabs also appeal to history. Arab rule in Spain had lasted for more than 700 years, one petition noted. The Arabs had considered Spain their home and had left their imprint on its culture. Would anyone dare suggest that they should now be allowed to return? I mean, excellent point. They wouldn't think that would be normal. But yet, the Jews who'd been gone even longer than the Muslims have been gone from Spain, they would not make, they're trying to make a claim that the Muslims say, well, we would never make such a claim. That's a crazy idea. So what were the demands, the three basic demands that we would hear over and over? Independence for the nation, which is what was given to all the other mandatory territories, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Egypt. So why not us? So one, independence, which I think is a reasonable demand. All the other mandatory territories had that. You had Lebanon, Syria, Egypt. So that was one demand that was reasonable the Arabs had. No Jewish immigration. Now, if you had designated an area for the Jews and negotiated for it, bought it, certainly the Jews could have had immigration to their own territory. So they couldn't, I think, make a demand that there could be no Jewish immigration in all of Palestine. And a prohibition against Jewish land purchases. I think this is also problematic because many Palestinians sold their land to Jews. So I think these three demands, independence would have solved, I think, the other two, because it would have allowed them to have their own rules in their part of the country. But that didn't happen, obviously. For a number of reasons, starting with the first one, that they didn't have a leader, a Mandela, a Gandhi character who could lead them forward. They just had a lot of squabbling. And later on, we'll see in the war, they had Arab states that were really focused on their own needs rather than caring about what the Palestinians want. The Palestinians have even been abandoned by their fellow Arabs over and over. That's something else that I've continued to learn. During the 1920s, Jews and Arabs came into contact predominantly through the Jews' efforts to buy the country from its owners, and the Arabs were willing to sell. Generally, more land was available than the Zionist movement could afford to buy. Some of the landowners lived outside Palestine, some of the sellers were land agents, and some were farmers offering their property directly to prospective buyers. Among those who sold were leaders of the Arab national movement, patriots on the outside, traitors on the inside. I don't think this can be emphasized enough. The idea that the Jews really were willing to do this. And so the question has to be, yes, it may not have been foreseen what was going to happen in the largest way, let's say at the Nakba. But as I said, the Palestinians identified what the Zionists wanted to do, and yet they were still willing to sell land to them. And there wasn't any leader who was able to convince them, don't sell this land. If so, this is going to be the consequence. And instead, there was more land available than the Zionist movement could afford to buy. So we have to be honest about what was happening. The Arabs did sell land. The Palestinians did sell land. And even some leaders of the nationalist movement, throw the Zionists out. Secretly, they would sell land to the Zionists. The Arab leaders' willingness to sell land to the Jews heightened the contempt Zionist leaders felt for the Arab national movement. And understandably, if you say we're all about the Palestinians and, death to Zionism, and then secretly you make deals with Zionism to sell the land, I would feel disgust and contempt for them as well. And I'm not saying that what the Zionists planned was right, but if you're just talking about buying and selling land from someone, you can do that with anybody. It's not illegal. There's nothing immoral about buying or selling land. It's just that there was no national cohesiveness, no national conscience, that if we keep selling the land to the Zionists, they're going to kick us out. And they did it over and over. And the Palestinians knew this. They knew that when Jewish landowners bought the land, they insisted on what was known as Hebrew labor, and they made sure that the tenant farmers who'd been farming the land for centuries in their family, they were kicked out. And they knew that that's what would happen, and yet they sold them the land anyway. The popular and near spontaneous outbreaks of violence fostered by Al-Qassam were expressions of social unrest, national rage, and the dark mood of a generation that had matured under British rule. When I read this, I thought that this was, let's say, a pre-intifada, that at times throughout the Palestinians' history, they just had it, and they have to express themselves in some way. And we saw this very early on. I want to take a moment to take a long read from a section just to illustrate, as I've said in my first review, how well I think Tom Segev writes and narrates and brings you into the story, but also to illustrate something that hasn't changed: the useless death of Palestinians in Palestine. On the morning of the day that took him to Accra prison, Kirkbride woke to the green and gold of a wonderful spring. How could you hang people on such a nice day, he thought, but set out on his way. An armored police car drove ahead of him. He was scheduled to attend 3 executions. The first hanging had been set for 8 a.m. Acre prison was located in an 18th century stone fortress. Kirkbride arrived 15 minutes early. He stood on the bridge that spanned the fortress's moat and chatted with the warden and the local medical officer who had come out to greet him. A Muslim clergyman passed by on his way to prepare the first of the condemned men. He greeted the district commissioner, and Kirkbride thought he saw the blackest hatred in his eyes. Kirkbride felt guilty and mean and was plagued by a sense of remorse. He had to remind himself that he had not been the one who had pronounced the death sentences. The gallows room was a kind of alcove in the fortress's inner wall. Its walls were whitewashed, the windows narrow, sinister slits. The setting looked medieval to Kirkbride. On the floor was a wooden platform with a trapdoor at its center. Above was a beam from which 3 ropes dangled. The district commissioner had no sooner entered the room and taken his place in a far corner than 2 jailers entered with the first of the condemned men, an Arab in his 20s. He was accompanied by the policeman who had been present at the young man's trial and who now had to identify him right under the gallows. The prison warden began reading the sentence out loud, but the prisoner cut him short. "Get it over with, for God's sake," he shouted. The spirit of the Palestinians, it's here too. His hands were handcuffed behind his back. The jailers tied his elbows together as well and covered his head with a black sack. At least he would not have to see the man's face, Kirkbride thought. The man was placed on the trapdoor. Kirkbride noticed the precise spot was marked in chalk. The jailers tied his ankles and took a few steps back. The warden slammed a lever, the trapdoor dropped, and the young man fell forward and down through the opening, rebounding when the rope reached full extension. The entire platform trembled from the force of his fall. The young man lost consciousness but did not die immediately. His body continued to jerk for several long minutes, and his feet spread despite their having been tied. Blood dripped from beneath the black hood. The sailor said he had hit his head when he fell, but the warden corrected them with all the force of his superior knowledge. The blood came from a burst vein in the nasal cavity. The medical officer tore open the man's shirt and listened to his heart, which was still beating at a good rate. He waited a little longer and then pronounced the man dead. Kirkbride went out to the sunny courtyard, and there, he noted with relief, the odors of mildew and antiseptic were less penetrating than inside. Until the next hanging at 9, the district commissioner sat in the warden's office where he ate breakfast. The second hanging was like the first, with the exception that the condemned man made a mess of the procedure. When the jailers placed him on the trapdoor, he fainted and had to be held up to ensure a clean fall. This time, the assembly waited 20 minutes before the medical officer pronounced the man dead. The wait seemed interminable to the district commissioner. In the time remaining before the next hanging at 10, Kirkbride toured the prison. He hated visits to prisons, he wrote, but anything was better than sitting idly and waiting. As he walked past the cells, the inmates fell silent. All eyes followed him. Everyone knew why he had come. Through the bars of one of the cells, he noticed the prisoner running back and forth. He asked who the man was. He was the next victim. The feeling that had accompanied the district commissioner throughout the morning grew stronger. People were killed in wars he knew, but what he had come to do in Acre prison was an abominable deed. He was swamped with an overwhelming feeling of pity, partly for the condemned men and partly for himself. He hoped he would be able to face his own death bravely when it came, as these men had, he wrote, somewhat pathetically. In one cell at the end of the corridor, there were several Jewish prisoners accused of belonging to terrorist organizations. Their eyes were also full of hatred. Not, of course, because I had come to hang a few Arabs, Kirkbride wrote. The fact that I was British was enough. Only one man did not look at him. The prisoner was leaning on an embrasure, staring out to sea. Kirkbride felt an odd need to thank him for not staring. After the third hanging, the district commissioner still had one more job to do, filling the role of coroner and holding an inquest. This was largely a formality, but it involved viewing the 3 bodies lying on a marble slab, their faces swollen and purple. Their deaths solved nothing, Kirkbride thought, and told himself that it might be a good idea to require judges to be present when their sentences were carried out. So, these executions of Palestinians has been happening in Palestine at the hands of foreigners for many, many years. And what were their crimes? In all likelihood, often it was defending their homes, resisting resisting the encroachments of Zionism. Not trying to say that nobody has ever committed a crime or no Palestinians have committed crimes. Obviously, they haven't, and maybe these men had committed murder and were very justified in their hangings. But why I read this passage and why I wanted you to hear not just Segev's prose, but the story itself, is to see that what the Palestinians have been experiencing in Palestine has been happening for a very long time in different guises and in different ways. But the fact that their people continue to carry on is remarkable. And I think that's something that any of us who are following, trying to understand the story, can really admire in the Palestinians. They have this incredible resilience and this ability to keep going despite everything that is against them. There's also something else I'd like to read to you, which we saw in some of the poetry, like of Hassan Kanafani, this beautiful expression of cultural love. As Al-Sakakini is fleeing his house in a neighborhood in the old city of Jerusalem, he realizes he can't take his books. And he wrote later, "Are you safe, my books? I don't know what your fate was after we left. Were you ruined? Were you burned? Were you respectfully transferred to a library, public or private? Or did you end up at a corner grocery store, your pages wrapped around onions?" And when I think about that, I think of that scene of the baker whose wife had torn out pages of poetry in Edmond Rostand's Cyrano de Bergerac. Did you end up at a corner grocery store, your pages wrapped around onions? And the books were taken. Interestingly, his daughters, in the summer of 1967, Hala and Dumia al-Sakakini went to the National Library in Jerusalem and found their father's books there. The Hebrew University sometimes attached members to its staff to Haganah forces. They would collect books from abandoned Arab houses. So we know the fate of those books, stolen and put into a library. But at least I would argue Sakakini would be happy for that, right? He said, "Were you respectfully transferred to a library, public or private?" So he was glad that they were not burned or used to wrap onions. So Sakakini's books, they may live with the enemy, but at least they still live. And as a way to think about what the Nakba felt like from somebody who was there, this again comes from al-Sakakini. The tragedy of the Arab refugees from Palestine was a product of the Zionist principle of separation and the dream of population transfer. The tragedy was inevitable, just as the war itself was inevitable. The number of refugees reached approximately 750,000. Some planned their departure, some fled, and about half were expelled. Notice again that the new historians all agree it was almost 1 million, 750,000 that were expelled. And none of this idea. Some planned their departure, some fled, about half were expelled. Whatever the idea is, it wasn't that the Arab leaders told them to leave or they left on their own. People left their country, dazed and directionless, without homes or money, falling ill and dying while wandering from place to place, living in niches and caves, their clothing falling apart, leaving them naked, their food running out, leaving them hungry. The mountains grew colder, and they had no one to defend them. As always, Sakakini did not shrink from self-criticism. "What breaks our hearts is that the Arab countries see and hear and do nothing," he said. Luckily, and in some ways catastrophically, they had places to flee to which weakened their resolve. Possibly the lives of many Arabs were saved because they fled their homes, but the mass flight destroyed their national fabric for many years to come. So, once again, if you like what you've been hearing so far, stay around for part 3, which will premiere right after this. If you'd like to buy a copy of the book, that's below. Like, subscribe, share with people who are interested in deep history behind this. This goes prior to the State of Israel. This is going to take you up until 1947, right before the British leave, and it's going to weave through. It's 500 pages. It's a lot to read, but it's beautifully written, and you feel like you're there, and with all of these people's hopes and dreams, both on both sides, and even in some ways, some of the hopes of some of the British for peace for these people. But we'll talk about that in the next review. If you'd like to support this work even further than a like or subscribe, as I said, you could buy the book or you could join my Patreon. YouTube members. A portion of any of the ways that you support via the super thanks will go towards the Palestine Children's Relief Fund, which supports medical procedures for children in Gaza who would not otherwise be able to receive it. Until next time, enjoy your reading and see you right now for the next review.